Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third lecture in the 2022 Darwin College Lecture Series. As I'm sure many of you know, our college prides itself on the nature of these lectures. We aim to foster intellectual curiosity, encourage outstanding communication of research and ideas, and champion interdisciplinarity. Our first speaker in this series on food was an astrophysicist who became a food and climate scientist. Our second was a practicing vet who became an animal health and welfare scientist and advocate for vegan pet foods. Today's speaker is a lawyer who became an environmental correspondent for the BBC and then took on an institutional leadership role as the CEO of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, which is the largest professional body of environmental practitioners in the UK and I believe, in fact, in the world. So it's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce Sarah Mukherjee tonight. She read law at Oxford University. You can't always choose the right place. And as a BBC environmental correspondent, she specialised in rural affairs and environmental issues. She covered many significant national and international events, the UK inquiry into mad cow disease, I remember well, and numerous UN intergovernmental environmental meetings, what we now all know as COPs, of course, on climate change, but various other global and national environmental issues. She was the first reporter to broadcast from under the Arctic ice shelf in Svalbard, in Spitsbergen, and undertook the first interview for quite a long time with Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, on his passion for environmental issues and sustainability. In addition to being the CEO of the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment, Sarah is a non-executive director on the board of the UK Environment Agency and a governor of Harper Adams University. And last year she was awarded an MBE for her services to agriculture and farmer well-being. I gather you're also an enthusiast for real ale, running and yoga, so we hope to see you in the college bar later on this evening and maybe in the garden doing yoga tomorrow morning and the gym in between, who knows. But please join me, everybody, in welcoming Sarah Mukherjee to deliver her Darwin College lecture on food, power and society. Sarah.
Hello, and I would first very much like to thank the Master and the Fellows of Darwin College for giving me the opportunity to present this lecture, to draw together thoughts that have been coalescing and percolating for the last 25 years or so about food, how we eat it, and why something that is so vital for our existence has become so incredibly complicated. Good, that's not complicated, thank goodness for that. So I started on the road to food policy as a correspondent for the BBC, specialising, as the Master said, in environmental and food matters. I was the first person of colour to present the BBC Radio 4 Farming Today programme, and I was contributing to BBC radio and TV outlets from the Today programme to Newsnight and everything in between. I also presented the food programme and BBC One's Country File. But after 20 years of reporting, I found it increasingly frustrating at having to report on policy decisions that I often thought were made with sometimes little evidence and sometimes little understanding. And so I left the BBC to work in the water industry, the agriculture industry, and finally ending up in my current role at IEMA. As well as the day job, I've sat on a number of government committees and charitable associations, all of which have helped to increase my understanding of food and food policy. My work on the advisory panel of the Glover Review on Protected Landscapes made me acutely aware of the tension sometimes between farming and the fragile and beautiful landscapes that we protect as national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. In addition, I was involved in the oh, sorry, forgive me. I'm going to do a Boris Johnson now. Ah, they're printed on two sides. They were trying to save the planet. Yes. Anyone seen Peppa Pig? Sorry. diminishing, where were you? Diminishing, but vital role of farming in rural communities. My work as an advisory panel member on the National Food Strategy made me acutely aware that the conversations about food happening at the policy level were in many cases bearing no resemblance to the daily experience of people who are eating to live and not living to eat. Over the course of nearly a quarter of a century, oh, I'm so old, quarter of a century, of talking to people in all parts of the food chain and in dozens of countries, I've concluded that farmers and consumers are similarly powerless to act effectively in a system that has dragged all power and profit to the centre of the supply chain. However, I should say right at the beginning that none of the hats I've mentioned I'm wearing at the moment. Over the next 50 minutes or so, I will set out a personal view of the food system, why I think that we are where we are, what tools we have as citizens to fight against it. I'll suggest that a lack of collaboration in UK farming and a lack of education amongst UK consumers has contributed, as it has in other Western countries, to other actors vacuuming up all the profit and the power. And I'll also suggest that the middle classes have used food as a way of entrenching their perceived superiority, talking at but not listening to those who are regularly chastised for poor food choices. And I did put that photo at the bottom. That was one of my less happy moments as a journalist. I was presenting a piece on the national park, newest national park, which was the New Forest National Park, and the presenter said, here's our environment correspondent, Sarah Mukherjee, she's the one on the right. And then made it 100 times worse by saying, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't know why I said that, just please stop talking, it's bad enough. And I didn't even get to interview the horse, which was a shame. But first, let me take you back to the year 2000, when I was a general reporter at the BBC and beginning to develop a specialisation in rural and agricultural affairs. I put together a series on the state of British agriculture ahead of the publication of the then Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott's so-called Rural White Paper entitled A Fair Deal for Rural Britain. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. I was trying to answer the question, who is making money from British farming? I must have visited dozens of British farms, the sort of bucolic small family farms beloved of television drama producers, nestled in lush green countryside with cows lowing in the field and sheep safely grazing, a splendid Georgian farmhouse complete with an Aga and a solid wood dining table, and of course a central casting farmer, more often than not, with a photogenic dog by his side. Now, at first glance, everything would seem absolutely perfect. The livestock and machinery were in perfect order, the yard was neat and tidy, the field and hedgerows sensitively managed for good productive farming and wildlife. And then, you'd see the livery stables in another part of the farm. You'd notice the business units housed in what used to be the dairy. You'd realise that the farmer's partner or children were running businesses from the farmhouse. And then, as you began to talk, you realised that the additions to the business were what actually was keeping the farm afloat. The farmer would admit that without the accountancy businesses, or the fact that his, and it was always a his, wife was a teacher, and it was always a wife, a policeman or a private chef, they would be unable to stay on the farm. And what really surprised me was that the fact that whilst they were very happy to talk about how inequitable the UK and EU subsidy system was, or the cost of fertiliser and the effect that was having on farm profitability, they seemed to be unwilling to address the elephant, or should I say the £1,800 Aberdeen Angus in the room. And that was the fact that the farm itself would not be viable without another business propping it up. Now, that certainly wasn't to say that everyone was making a loss. I spoke to two farmers who were profitable. The first was farming thousands of acres in the east of England. Bearing in mind this was still in the days of EU membership, he was unconcerned about EU. He was more interested in the WTO and the GATT talks. He didn't have a farmhouse, he had a boardroom, and his secretary brought us in coffee and cakes while we talked. He had just started packaging his own potatoes, and he was beginning to develop ways of adding value. For example, like ready meals or already mashed potato. And don't you roll your eyes, because we all know we've done it, haven't we? We've put it in the shopping trolley with a nice steak and a bottle of Merlot on our way to having a meal that we didn't have to cook ourselves. Now, the other person who was making money was completely the other side of the scale. He was an organic, permaculture, small-scale farmer with a handful of animals and a few hectares of land. He took all his animals to be slaughtered locally and then sold them to farmers markets to people who would pay a hefty premium for locally sourced and high welfare meat. Now, whilst his profits obviously were not on the same scale as the potato farmer, he was still in the black rather than the red. Now, if you had put these two farmers in the room together, you would have found pretty much nothing that linked them. They didn't have the same outlook on life, they didn't have the same outlook on farming, but the only thing was they called themselves farmers, and they both had, in very different ways, taken hold of their own supply chain. They had become price makers rather than price takers. Nearly a generation later, and you have no idea how old that makes me feel, everything and nothing has changed. So let's start with everything. The Anderson's Agricultural Outlook is one of the best-read publications in the industry, produced by an organisation that has been delivering business advice, research and economic analysis to the food, farming and agricultural sectors for more than 40 years. This year, it's a bit of a page-turner. Every article has a serious message about future ways of farming, the pandemic, the pinch points and difficulties in securing inputs like fertiliser and agricultural chemicals, the pace of change in legislation with the Environment and Agriculture Acts, the change in who and with whom farmers can trade, and free trade agreements agreed by the UK government that could have, according to Anderson's, a significant effect in future on a range of farming operations. Overall, one of the authors concludes, it will be a disruptive decade for UK farming on multiple levels. Another says that the farming industry will continue to face a roller coaster of profitability. Now, this may not sound to the casual observer as anything too much to write home about, but given the traditional understated, one could say somnolent Anderson style, this is the equivalent of the bit in the disaster movie when everybody realizes the enormity of what's about to happen and starts running around screaming. And as you can see from this slide, also from the Anderson's report, they might have a point. Part of the report was devoted to the change in agricultural payments. Until the UK left the EU, British farmers were paid in the same way as other European farmers were, through the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. Originally set up to increase productivity and stabilise markets in a Europe still haunted by the spectre of wartime hunger, in the 1970s and 1980s, tales of butter mountains and beef mountains bought and stored by European officials to keep the price of produce artificially high led to calls for reform. But we tend to forget that when we were subsidising farmers, we were doing so well before the butter mountains. Governments have intervened to keep the price of basic commodities stable for hundreds of years. And after World War II, many years before the UK joined the EU, farmers were paid to produce food. When I was still working at the BBC, I interviewed Lord Plumb, who was president of the National Farmers Union in the 1970s and president of the European Parliament in the 1980s. He told me that it was Sir Winston Churchill who said just after the war, 30 million people living on an island where we produce enough food for, say, 15 million is a spectacle of majesty and insecurity that this country can ill afford. Lord Plumb told me the system of guaranteed payments, which was created in 1947, created a stable market, and he described them as consumer subsidies. Now, this might sound like a contradiction in terms, but many commentators agree that CAP helped underwrite the huge growth in agricultural productivity in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And we'll look at what happened as a result of that through the consumer's eyes a little later in this lecture. Over the years, the EU institutions were keen to move subsidies away from propping up production to supporting the rural economy, as it became more and more clear that we were simply producing too much food. Instead, they encouraged farmers to create good environmental outcomes. And when the UK left the European Union, the government was keen to pay farmers to produce good countryside and not food. Earlier this year, George Eustice, the Secretary of State for the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA, announced a rollout of a new landscape recovery projects, up to 15. He said they would be selected in the first wave, focusing on two themes: recovering England's threatened native species and restoring England's rivers and streams. Officials at DEFRA say these pilot projects alone are expected to deliver significant environmental benefits, including the creation of 10,000 hectares of restored wildlife habitat, carbon savings between 20 to 50 kilotons per year, and the improved status of around half of the most threatened species in England, including the Eurasian curlew, the sand lizard, and the water vole. I'll leave that up for a little while. Mr. Eustace said in the same speech that he wants to see profitable farming businesses producing nutritious food, underpinning a growing rural economy where nature is recovering and people have better access to it. Farmers' leaders are pointing to the recently completed Free Trade Agreement, or FTA, with Australia as a sign that this might be more difficult than it looks, and that policy around the environment and deals around trade are not meshing into a consistent whole. Minette Batters, the current president of the National Farmers Union, said that the FTA, far from supporting UK high welfare standards and environmental outcomes, pits British farmers toe-to-toe with one of the most cost-efficient agricultural sectors in the world, producing food to different rules and different standards. She added, "Our experience of these negotiations has not lived up to the government's ambitions for strong industry collaboration and trade deals. Instead, we have consistently learned of the outcome of the negotiations after the fact, sometimes from the Australian government rather than our own." All these changes, this wave of disruption, might be manageable if farming was secure, solvent, and the farming community had the bandwidth to navigate a future profitable path through these 4 or 5 different levels of complexity. But as we can see from the next 2 slides, farmers are about the only actors in the supply chain that are losing money. It's fair to say, indeed, that it's only when food leaves the farm gate that it starts making money. As you can see, this slide, and there are several from the excellent database collated for the National Food Strategy, which if you're interested in this space, I would really recommend that you have a look at. This slide demonstrates that even the people supplying inputs to the farming sector are making more money than farmers themselves. Now, there's quite a lot of explanatory rubric that goes with the slide to explain these calculations, so this is perhaps an overly simplistic version. But as you can see, without the incremental margin for subsidy for producers, on aggregate, farmers are making a loss. So let me just say that again for emphasis. On aggregate, farmers would be making a loss if it were not for subsidies. And this is where nothing has changed. Those liveries, business units, and family members with salaries outside the farm I encountered a generation ago are still essentially subsidizing our bog-off deals as we wheel our trolleys around our supermarkets of choice. The reality is that many farmers are living week to week or month to month. They simply do not have the bandwidth or the capital to be making the sort of strategic decisions that the whole sector will need if farmers are to navigate a way to success through this complicated landscape. But why is this? I mean, we've all got to eat. According to the UN World Food Programme, up to 811 million people do not have enough food, and 43 countries are in danger of sliding into famine. Food, air, and water are 3 of the absolute essentials for life, right at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And yet, we find ourselves in the situation where, on average, British farmers are making a loss on everything they produce. And this is taking place at a time when food politics, whilst not always on the front pages, well, not at the moment certainly, does excite enough interest in the newspaper reading classes to feature at fairly regular intervals. Many of the arguments I have heard made by critics of the current system pitch farmers and consumers against each other, as if this is a binary argument. However, I would contend that both farmers and consumers are trapped in a system in which they have virtually no agency. They both need to rediscover their power in order to balance out what is currently an out-of-kilter system. Now, when I was presenting BBC Radio 4's Farming Today programme, we used to spend an awful lot of time trying to work out who was making money in agriculture. Now, if you spoke to farmers in the UK, and remember this was still when we were in the EU, they would say, well, of course, we live with such an unlevel playing field because farmers in the rest of the EU get subsidies we don't, because the UK government won't match fund in the same way that, for example, the French or the Germans will. And there was some truth in that. They'd also point out that animal welfare standards were different in the EU. For example, we introduced a stalling and tethering ban for our pork production well before other European countries, such as the Danes, meaning Danish bacon was cheaper to produce, and the single market tariff-free trade meant it was also cheaper to introduce into this country. And again, those UK farmers had a point. But if you talk to the French or Danish farmers, they'd say, well, look at the Australians, they're making loads of money. What about the Americans? What about the South Americans? But I spent a lot of time talking to small family farmers in the United States when I worked there, who were in the same position as those I spoke to in the UK, cross-subsidising their farms and taking positions and work elsewhere and living off what subsidies they could. Talk to farmers in Australia, and they say, well, there isn't enough money in farming to compensate for our long hours, and we live and work in the most variable climate in the world, and we have to pay higher labour costs than our competitors. Indeed, figures from the Australian government show farm profitability 2018 to 19 to 2020 to 21 at around 67,000 Australian dollars a year, with a rate of return of about 1.6%, which I guess is better than sticking it under the mattress, but certainly is a poor rate of return if you're looking at even the most conservative stocks and shares portfolio. So back to the UK. And let's consider the next step in that supply chain, the asymmetric nature of the relationship between farmers and supermarkets. Farmers who deal directly with supermarkets are essentially one-person bands trying to do equitable deal with a multi-billion-pound multinational organisation, 5 of whom take more than 80% of the supermarket business in the UK between them. If that's not a David and Goliath battle, I'm not quite sure what is. The inequity of this relationship allows the supermarkets, with their teams of lawyers and financial advisors, to de-risk their own operations at the expense of farmers. I was told of dozens of examples when I was a journalist of this inequality in action. A vegetable grower in the east of England told me one consignment of carrots they sent to one of the major supermarkets was rejected. No reason given, no payment made. Moreover, his goods were not returned. They were simply kept within the system, and he never really found out what happened to them. Now, it's many years since I did a law degree, and thank you, Master, for even mentioning it, but this sounded to me like almost the definition of theft. You don't pay someone for the goods, you don't return them, and they don't get any money or their goods back. However, the farmer told me that this was standard practice in the contracts that they signed. Sometimes the supermarkets paid, sometimes they didn't, and contractually they didn't have to do either. I was told of an instance of a top fruit farmer, so top fruit, apples, pears, anything up there, plums, that the buyer for the supermarket he supplied decided that the amount of blush, that's that rosy bit, that on the apples that they were buying should be a different amount between him sending his apples in and the supermarket receiving them. So no payment, no return. The imbalance of this relationship has not passed unnoticed by the Competition Commission, now the Competition and Markets Authority. There have been a couple of inquiries into the UK grocery market, and the conclusions were, as you would expect with this kind of evidence, the agency in the relationships was entirely in the hands of the buyer rather than the seller. As a result, the grocery code was agreed with an adjudicator able to consider cases and make judgments, and these powers were strengthened a few years ago. But farmers' leaders believe these measures just don't go far enough, and a central problem remains, which is that farmers themselves are too concerned to go to the adjudicator in the first place for fear of losing these contracts, whilst egregious, do provide some tiny semblance of stability and income. So I realise I've set out a pretty depressing picture of the state of UK, perhaps even world farming. Obviously, it's unsustainable as a state of affairs, and something, as an angry letter writer to a broadsheet might say, needs to be done. So what are the options for rebalancing power in the agricultural system? When other individuals have found themselves in unequal battles with purchasers of the fruits of their labour, they've collaborated in order to increase their collective bargaining power, whether it be a class action lawsuit or forming or joining a trade union. In other countries, particularly our geographical and competitive neighbours such as France and the Netherlands, cooperative farming is a model that is both well used and successful. However, according to a report published a couple of years ago by the Royal Agricultural University, UK cooperatives account for 6% of business in relative sectors, compared with 68% in the Netherlands and 55% in France. Now, I've seen firsthand how this cooperative model can work for the profit of farmers. Whilst at the BBC, I did a series of features on farming practices in the UK and Europe, and met the very bright and very business-minded leader of the Ja Natürlich movement of organic farmers in Austria at the time. He told me that the power of cooperation had allowed the movement to demand premium shelf space in the deli counter of major supermarkets. We told them they could either have our products and put them where shoppers were going to see them, he said, or we take our products elsewhere. The upshot was that Ja Natürlich was at the front and center of shoppers' eyes and minds every time they entered a supermarket. Now, admittedly, Austrian consumers are, according to surveys, much more likely to pay over the odds for Austrian produce, whereas British shoppers lead Europe in shopping for a bargain. When it comes to farming, however, there are hundreds of examples across Europe of the power of collective action, not just with marketing, but from the efficiencies of buying inputs or sharing equipment and collaborating in this way and the benefits that it offers. It could seem, you might think, a no-brainer to collaborate in this way. But one of the main obstacles to this was beautifully summed up by one of the farmers who participated in a focus group for the report on cooperatives that I mentioned earlier. And I think it's worth using that quotation in full. He said, "The attitude of a lot of farmers is the competition isn't farmers in the USA or France or Germany or anywhere else. Their competition is the guy over the hedge there. If they can do better than their neighbor, then they're doing a good job." That does mean is it stifles best practice and intellectual sharing, efficiency, and management. Farmers love to compete against each other rather than actually work out how they can work together in everybody's best interest. Again, this is little change from a generation previously. In 2002, the Curry Report on the future of food and farming had a memorable quotation from a farmer that the road to British agriculture is paved with the corpses of dead cooperatives. Now, increasingly, farmers are finding themselves having to collaborate when it comes to big-ticket items like farm machinery, but the lack of desire to cooperate potentially puts UK farming at a unique and significant disadvantage. So, if you don't want to collaborate, can you survive on your own? I cannot tell you how many farmers' meetings I have been to where, during the question and answer session, a farmer will get up and proudly state, "My name's John Smith and I'm a fifth-generation farmer." There's usually a susurrus of approval that follows this kind of introduction. In fact, it happens so often you don't even think about it when you're there. But nobody gets up and says, "My name's John Smith and I'm a fifth-generation accountant," or "My name's John Smith, I'm a fifth-generation academic," because nobody cares. And the fact that these generations of academic or accountancy experience, actually they could be a hindrance rather than a help. You might be stuck in your ways or unable to innovate. And the same is true for farming. I've sat and listened to so many farmers in this position who are mentally self-editing, pushing down their own dreams and aspirations, burdened by the hands of their great or great-great-grandfathers, and it's always a father, tapping them on the shoulder from the grave, reminding them how it was when they were a lad and how change means uncertainty. One friend of mine is an agricultural valuer and tells me his job is part accountancy, part therapy, getting farmers with intensely unprofitable businesses through the mental hurdles of letting the family down when they finally agree to sign the relevant documents. The look, he said, of relief on their face when they are finally divested of this intergenerational burden is a sight to behold. Some thought leaders in the agricultural world say that we need to reframe the way we think about farming, not as a calling or as an intergenerational burden, but as a job. The American author Sarah K. Mock, in her book Farm and Other F Words, says this simple change is in perspective is absolutely transformative. Few of us regular job-holding schlubs would think because Dad did it is a good enough reason to pursue a life's work, much less to shoulder the mantle of an entire identity. And when farms fail or farmers wish to move on, this reframing, she says, allows us to understand it for what it is, not the death of the American dream, but simply a person finding a better fit. So we've considered a few paths to successful future farming: taking over parts of your supply chain, collaborating, being too big or too little to care, or simply selling up and moving out and leaving someone else to be successful, to which we will return later. Another model, of course, of the farm is high-tech, the farm of the future. Harper Adams University, of course I have a special interest in this as I'm a governor, piloted a hands-free hectare in 2016, farming using robots and remote sensors. Hands-free farming, the clue is in the title. So successful was this approach and so much interest did it garner. This has now been expanded to a 3-year trial on 35 hectares and 3 combinable crops. 9 years ago, John Deere, the American agricultural equipment company, produced a video complete with cheesy music and a couple of good old farmer and buys, which showed the farmer with his morning cup of joe directing the day's business from a series of screens and information panels linked up to the tractor driver. And at the end of the day, he gathered real-time info about his crops and sent it to the data center for information for the next day's work. The future's very dark by the look of it. That just seemed to be that was my takeaway. And all of this is not as far off as you may think. In the same way as the Iron Age and the Industrial Revolution presented huge advantages in productivity, the digital revolution, which has changed all our lives so much, is already disrupting agriculture. AI can be used for anything from precision use of pesticides exactly where they're needed rather than spraying the whole field, to analysing when the best time to sow a crop will be, and even predicting crop yield and how much you will get for that crop when you finally reap it. However, all of this takes money, and as we've seen for thousands of small and family farm businesses around the world, money is the one commodity that is in very short supply. These farms may be embedded in their communities, they may be the sort of people who'll come and pull you out of a ditch if you get stuck in your car, or they'll clear the local roads of snow, but at present, many of them do not have a sustainable business and certainly don't have the tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars required to upskill their farm in the way John Deere predicts. This perhaps is one of the reasons why billionaires like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos are investing heavily in farmland, because of course land is finite. It's solid, it's a low-risk investment, it's easy to diversify, and according to many land agents I know, it's certainly outperformed some other forms of investment over the last few years. Indeed, one expert I spoke to recently in this area said it was already possible, if you should so desire, to farm fields in Lincolnshire from Utah or Colorado, with a little help from the odd technician. As the balance shifts from food production to environmental outcomes in terms of the subsidy regime, it's perfectly possible to see a capital-intensive way of farming that would be profitable way outside the subsidy system. But some farmers contend that this could change forever, our assumed connection between the land and those who farm it. Rather like those second homeowners who head up to the holiday cottage for a weekend with their bags of Waitrose shopping, other supermarkets are available, enjoying the chocolate box views but putting little into the local economy, they say this model of farming is deracinated from its locality. Land could be farmed from thousands of miles away by anonymous investors who won't care about your local amenity, the view from your window, or the fact that you like to walk or run or walk your dog along a particular path. They could have pockets deep enough to push through whatever changes to land might be needed if that's what makes most sense in terms of their return for investment. High tech, high carbon, high wildlife, high production, high amenity, so many possible paths to choose. I run a small business, and I would say that 20% of my time is spent on strategy. What are we going to do next? What are we going to do at the end of this year, or in 2, 5, or 10 years' time? That requires mental bandwidth, which even the most successful farmers struggle with. But for those who have the space, time, and expert support to help them think and innovate, there are paths to personal, professional, and economic fulfillment. During the jobs that I've done over the last 25 years, I've been immensely privileged and lucky to meet some genuine iconoclasts, people who are simply ripping up the rules and developing profitable, resilient, sustainable, and local business models. The rise of farm shops and farmers who showcase their own produce through restaurants and retail, the explosion of artisan beer and spirit producers, particularly in this neck of the woods, on local farms, farmer-led clusters that share best practice and costs, organisations like LEAF, Linking in Environment and Farming, that have demonstration farms up and down the country who open their doors to their peers and show how you can farm for profit and for nature. Farmers who are trialling ways of turning milkweed, usually considered the bane of farmers, into latex, or using the seed for comforters or jackets, as it's allegedly warmer than wool and more breathable than down. Waitrose has used packaging made out of waste tomato vines in order to reduce its reliance on plastic. All of these businesses albeit niche, underline that the path to UK farming success is multifaceted, and there's probably no one single business model that will suit everyone. Yes, we need farmers, of course, to produce food for millions of us, and we have farmers who do that every day to incredibly high standards. But the next few years will bring about more change than at any time in the past 40 years. Every farmer, no matter how successful, needs to think about what success will look like in 5 to 10 years' time. There is an opportunity for farmers to take back control, but in a way that brings them back some power as well. For too long, many farmers admit they've simply farmed to the subsidy, which I would contend has limited innovation. There are, as we have discussed, enormous challenges on the road to profitability, which I do not diminish, but farmers have, with these many paths to the future, the opportunity to collaborate across and up and down the supply chain, to meet and to learn from those who are best practice exemplars. For example, farmers have to stop subcontracting their brand to others. Supermarkets are plastered with stories about the farmers who supply them, but supermarkets are also taking the value of that branding as well. Government recognises it has a role to supporting learning and, if need be, a transition out of the industry. Appropriately and thoughtfully done, the opportunity is that this could bring a new skill set into farming. People with great ideas and ability to execute them who have not had access to land. There's also an opportunity to support those who wish to farm from non-traditional backgrounds. Farming is the least diverse sector in the UK economy, and there is much evidence to show that diverse businesses are more resilient, and an agricultural industry that better reflects the communities it feeds will also be more resilient. And this brings me to the second part of this lecture, moving on to consider the people all this innovation is for, consumers, and where they sit in the food system. I've already described how some supermarkets abuse their position in relation to farmers by using consumer choice as a stick with which to beat them. No wonky veg, no blush here, no blush there, blah, blah, blah. I've sat with senior people in parallel conversations on another bit of the food supply chains, the food processors, who have told me in all seriousness that the consumer is king, or should I say queen. Sleek, cologned executives with business degrees from expensive universities, educated in Cambridge, Massachusetts, wearing $1,000 suits with watches and cufflinks, discreet enough to demonstrate just how expensive they really are. I remember sitting in a cafe overlooking Lake Geneva with one of these people. Over a lightly dressed organic salad, he told me with a demeanour so self-effacing it could only have been purchased at a £10,000 a term private school that he and his colleagues were mere servants to the all-powerful consumer, overwhelmingly female, he told me, and increasingly from the global south. All she had to do was raise her hand in interest in a particular product, and he and the worldwide team supporting him would rush to meet her every demand. No, neither did I. Because the reality is, rather like our independent British farmer and the relationships with the supermarkets, we as consumers are far more likely to have our food created, curated, and framed by the people who sit around Lake Geneva than we are to be authors of our own choices, however much we think we are. As we've seen in a previous slide, food really doesn't get to be worth having from a commercial point of view unless you can fiddle about with it in order to make some profit. Let's go back to this idea of controlling your own supply chain in order to keep the value of the product. In the old days, the very old days, it was true of farmer and consumer alike. A farmer would go to market, sell whatever they had, and go back with the profits to reinvest. The consumer would buy the product, prepare it, eat it, all of it, and convert the food into energy in order to have a productive day. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not some sort of fantasist who thinks it would be just marvellous if we could all go back to living in yurts and using the barter system. Food safety regulations ensure that the risk we are taking in eating food is mitigated by good hygiene and robust practices in the preparation of food for market. And it's only fair to recognise the role that supermarkets have had in delivering fresh produce to the population. I vividly remember going down to London with my mother from Cambridge, where we lived when I was very little, on the Green Line coach. Remember the Green Line coach? In order to get some unappetizing looking and rather old courgette and aubergine from a Cypriot delicatessen, as buying vegetables for Mediterranean and South Asian cooking was almost impossible outside areas with big immigrant populations and the specialist shops that catered for them. A few months ago, to compare and contrast, I had a woman in an upmarket supermarket, Waitrose, Cambridge, complain that she could not find fresh lemongrass in the herb section for the curry she was cooking. However, much as it feels like we have more choice as we wander those supermarkets' aisles packed with produce, 80% of the supermarket trade rests with a handful of retailers in the UK. And research conducted by The Guardian newspaper and Food and Water Watch last year concluded that just a handful of firms control almost 80% of dozens of grocery items bought regularly by Americans. The consolidation runs deep. 4 firms or fewer controlled at least 50% of the market for 79% of the groceries. And in this article in 2016 for Business Insider, Kate Taylor demonstrated that 10 firms own pretty much every grocery brand you have ever heard of. Think you're buying small scale, funky, artisan, check the label and Google it. You may well find that there's a big conglomerate hiding behind it. As with so many things, there's often a healthy dose of misogyny attached to the narrative behind this explosion in the food processing industry. Before, yes, that really was an advert. If women hadn't crowbarred themselves out of the kitchen and started wanting to go to work, yes, people have actually said this out loud to me. If people hadn't demanded equality of opportunity, if women hadn't, then this would not have given the food companies a niche in which to stop producing their convenience meals. To start producing their convenience meals. And now they say, look at it, rows and rows of convenience foods picked up by working women who can't be asked to create a healthy meal for their family. Well, the reality, of course, is that it's far more subtle and complex. And these are genuine adverts, by the way. They're not jokes. They are actual things that people thought was a good idea to put in newspapers. Yes, how we've changed. The reality, you will not be surprised to hear, is more subtle and complex. Yes, changing social demographics did, of course, have a part to play in the rise of convenience foods, but so did a post-war food strategy across developed nations, which was grounded in the admirable desire never to starve again. Millions starved in the Second World War and post-war period, and millions more went hungry. The Dig for Victory campaign was not just a way to find something for a bored wartime nation to do. Before the war, we imported huge amounts of food from the Commonwealth and from Europe. And once Germans started attacking the merchant navy and the European trading partners were occupied, there was a danger that we would starve. Some sources suggest the UK was simply weeks away from running out of food. When democratic function was restored to Western Europe, leaders were told in no uncertain terms by their populations to secure the supply of dairy products, bread, meat, and other staples. And when the Common Agricultural Policy was introduced in 1962, the point was to guarantee prices for products in order to maintain public health in terms of adequate nutrition, rather than to keep farmers on the land. Tim Lang, Emeritus Professor of Public Health Policy at City University London's Centre for Food Policy, argues that this post-war food consensus is now not fit for purpose. The drive and determination to end world hunger and increase productivity across the countries that suffered in the Second World War was fantastically successful in increasing production, but that simply created a structure in which these food processing companies could thrive. They took the now cheap commodities and added value by processing and branding them. And now, Professor Lang contends, we have built ourselves a system that provides food that does not nourish or sustain us. In research that he carried out with a colleague 15 years ago, he says he discovers that Coca-Cola's advertising budget was bigger than the entire budget for the World Health Organization for 2 years. And whilst we might flatter ourselves into thinking that we are immune to advertising, just think how internationally recognizable these brand logos are. Research conducted for the National Food Strategy showed that consumers are very aware of the need to eat healthily. 90% of people said they considered eating well to be important or very important in how they felt about their overall health. Many respondents who were questioned worldwide said they tried to avoid artificial flavors or colors or gluten or sugar or any of the other things that we are told on a regular basis we should avoid. Low fat, low carb, flexitarian, we're all grasping around for that thing that will help us lose the lockdown stone and make us feel 20 years younger. Well, not everybody here 20 years younger, but me, definitely. Every day, there's another newspaper article telling us what or what not to eat based on some research or the other. But the reality is, if you talk to nutritionists, that research is probably sponsored by the food industry itself and is scoped out to fill a particular agenda. As Tim Spector says in his book Spoon-Fed, a typical series of headlines in 2019 announced eating walnuts daily protects against cancer and colitis. Woohoo! In the scientific paper, in fact, the scientific paper merely described that mice that had been given chemicals to mimic human disease showed a slight improvement in metabolic profiles after 2 weeks of walnut therapy. The study was small and appeared in a modest but genuine nutrition journal, but the sponsors of the study, the Californian Walnut Commission, must have been delighted with the acres of free publicity. And yet, no matter how much we know, or at least how much we think we know, greater knowledge does not seem to lead to better outcomes. The UK average BMI has increased steadily over the past 100 years, and there's been a 14% increase since 1977. When I was at the BBC, I was being told then by cardiologists they were seeing incipient heart disease and diabetes in children as young as 7, and it is shocking that we are not shocked by those figures anymore. It's estimated that the food industry creates more than £50 billion a year in health-related costs, and if obesity rates rise at the rate they are doing presently, 2/3 of the current population of 10-year-olds will be obese by the time they're 50. In addition, research is now increasingly being carried out on the ultra-processed food, these products that contain stuff you'll never find in your kitchen at home, and often sit at the apex of the taste triumvirate of fat, salt, and sugar. Physiology that evolved to keep hunter-gatherers alive tens of thousands of years ago is no match for a salted caramel-covered donut or a bag of chocolate-covered pretzels. A few years ago, when I was working regularly in the United States, I spoke to many people involved in the food industry over there. Those who cooked anything from scratch, in their view, were outliers, and most home-cooked food contained a packet or a jar of sauce or some other processed product. The conversations did not revolve around taste at all, but mouthfeel. The ultimate mouthfeel, I was told, not only included those three foundations of salt, sweet, and fat, but hardly required any chewing either. It kind of yielded and melted. Yeah, that is a thing. And millions of dollars were spent researching the ultimate mouthfeel and then selling it to us. It appears that when it comes to food, we follow our cousins across the Atlantic rather than those across the Channel. Forgive me. We spend more on ready meals than our European neighbours and yet less on food. Indeed, 50% of our calories as a nation come from ultra-processed food. Less than the States, but more than Europe. Back in the UK, our screens are full of food porn, cheeky chappies or alluring cooks giving the camera their best coquettish side glances as they whip up a meal for all their pretend friends as jazz music plays in the background. Food is a middle-class obsession. Every week, real and virtual pages are devoted to the next big food craze, from miniature pineapples to zoog and dishes you can whip up for all your chums on a Saturday night. That is interspersed, of course, with people lecturing us about how unhealthy we are, and I think partly that's because food is one of the few areas left where middle-class people can wag their fingers at people on limited incomes through the guise of being worried about their health. I have to be honest, I have a big chip here. I spent many of my formative years in a crappy council estate in Essex, and yet another old Etonian lecturing me on primetime television is enough to make me want to put my foot through the screen. And patently, all this lecturing is simply not working. Because, as you might notice the theme here, the reality and the reasons people are overweight are difficult and complex. One of the people I had the honour to sit on the National Food Strategy Advisory Panel with is Denise Bentley, here on the left, co-founder of the First Love Foundation. The foundation is a charity that Denise makes clear is not a food bank. They will help you with food, but only if you're willing to work with them on the reasons as to why you need a food bank in the first place. Before the pandemic, she told me of people that she worked closely with, some of them living in the shadow of the financial towers of Canary Wharf, who were living on the edge. One was just living on butter, just butter. They'd fallen out of the system, the benefits they were entitled to, they were not able to access, and they did not have the tools or skills to help them eat healthily. Since the pandemic, like many other charities, they have been rushed off their feet, as you can imagine. When I last caught up with her a few months ago, she talked to me about some families they have been supporting who had been working in hospitality or retail, who found that overnight 2 salaries became none, and that of the £23,000 a year benefit cap, 17,000 was going on rent. So you do the math. 17,000 on rent and 23,000 for the rest of the year, for everything. It's not even working, to be honest, all this nagging, for the demographic that looks down on others, for their poor food choices. The National Food Strategy identified leisurely home cooks as one of the 9 demographic groups: older empty nesters, many retired, high education, medium to high income. They ate varied diets, high in fruit and veg and fish, and normally ate at the table. And 80% of them were overweight or obese. Whilst many have trilled about the benefits of being at home during the pandemic, of the increasing cooking and bread making, and how marvellous it was to be able to nurture your own sourdough starter, for millions of other people, the pandemic simply exacerbated the problems they already had accessing healthy, affordable food in the first place. There is very little point being told you can make a nutritious meal with dried beans and vegetables if the nearest supermarket selling fresh produce is 2 bus rides away and your kitchen amounts to a microwave that you share with 3 or 4 other families in rented accommodation with no preparation space. If you add 2 hungry children into the mix, and there are people like this everywhere, just talk to Denise about this, 2 hungry children and the tiredness and the lack of mental and emotional bandwidth that you have when you are yourself badly nourished, all the soft-focused cookery programs and the nagging in the world are not going to help you. According to a 2018 report by the Social Market Foundation, 10.2 million individuals in Great Britain are living in food deserts, places where not being near a supermarket offering healthy food at low prices was a barrier to being able to eat more healthily. So again, quite a bleak picture, with consumers, rather like farmers, but at the other end of the food system, being trapped in a landscape not of their own making. But in a way, the answers are very similar. It's about skills, and it's about government intervention in the right places at the right time. Back to Tim Lang, the food policy professor. I first met him about 20 years ago when I was doing a report on how we can understand the food that we eat. He posited that the first step to getting people to eat anything that you gave them, regardless of provenance, was to take away the knowledge of how food was prepared. Now, I have to say at the time, I did think he was at the far end of the conspiracy theory spectrum, but it has become more and more clear that home economics classes, widespread cookery lessons, and teaching children how to prepare and enjoy their food does make an enormous difference in terms of the general understanding of nutritious food in society. There are some fantastic initiatives around that are trying to re-establish these skills for children, both on social media and through the charitable sector, for example, Chefs in Schools and the Square Food Foundation. But, and rather depressingly, you can say this about a lot of fantastic initiatives, there are not many avenues available to coordinate and share best practice in these schemes. Personally, I think this is one area that we could use the skills retained in our diverse communities in the UK. Speaking as someone of mixed heritage, the food I want to eat is very rarely available on the supermarket shelves or even in restaurants. I cook mostly from scratch. And I know there is an army of aunties out there of all descriptions who could help re-educate children or in some cases simply educate them about how to cook simple recipes. In addition, those who are interested in vegan or vegetarian diets will be able to learn a lot from communities in the Caribbean and South Asia, which have long traditions of eating in this way. In fact, the interest in vegan food is another area where the food processing companies have begun to try and make inroads. In a mature food market, it's a golden opportunity for them to add value. But a processed veggie burger or meatless chicken nuggets are still processed food. If your vegan diet consists of vegan versions of fast food favorites, that is not going to increase your nutritional intake. In a consultation entitled Your Future, Your Food, commissioned for the National Food Strategy, almost every group in the 24 focus groups of young people questioned saw education as the key, and that their peer group was the most important factor in determining where they decided to eat. I saw myself the power of working with children when I visited a project run by the World Health Organization in Poland, where a traditional diet of saturated fat and pork was having the inevitable health consequences. The project simply went into schools and to be honest, did little more than teach children about salad and how to cut up cucumbers and tomatoes and eat them. But the effects were dramatic. Not only were the children asking for more vegetables at school, but then they went home and spoke to their families, demanding that mum and dad got salad for them to cut up and present to the family. I think many of us who've had young children would have loved to have been in the position that some of the mums that I spoke to there were. They were rolling their eyes about the passion and determination of their children to source and consume salads at home. But I don't always think that a government solution is necessarily the best one, but I do think that we're at a stage where we need to introduce information into schools about healthy choices and shopping. Many of the children who were spoken with as part of the Your Future, Your Food project said that the proliferation of takeaways around schools meant it was simply easier to go to a fast food place or get a kebab than to try and work out what was healthy to eat in local supermarkets or grocers. Indeed, fast food outlets tend to be more prevalent in areas of greater deprivation. The plethora of information available online is dizzying and confusing, even for those of us who live and breathe food and food policy. Coffee is good for you, then it isn't. High carb, low fat, berries, goji berries, skim milk, plant milk. Rather like farmers dealing with their own pace of change, as a consumer, it's almost impossible to find the mental bandwidth to keep up with these ever-changing trends and research. Often, as I've described, research that has been carried out with an agenda in mind. Simple, basic advice about the practicalities of food shopping and preparation is something that I have heard overwhelmingly from educated and food policy professionals would be an attainable first step that would deliver real results. What does a good shop look like for £30? How do you turn that stuff in the trolley into decent meals that don't cost a fortune and don't mean high energy bills for preparation? We are not teaching this to children, and you have to ask why. Often, people go for the processed option, not just because it's the easiest, remember our family in shared accommodation with the microwave, but also because it's the cheapest. A loaf of white bread, a family bag of crisps, and a tub of margarine is not only easier to prepare than vegetables for the same price, but you know there probably won't be any waste, and it will last longer. 60% of the food in our shops is processed because it lasts longer on the shelves. If people have more money, they make better choices about the food they eat because they are able to. We ask the food system to do so many things, but at the end of the day, if we want people to have better nourishment and we want farmers to produce that high nutrition food, farmers need a fair share of the pie and people on low incomes need to be paid more. Because the outcomes for society and the economy could be immense, not just in terms of that £50 billion a year in health support that we wouldn't necessarily have to find, but also because well-nourished people are more productive and more creative. I've spoken to teachers where hot lunches have been reintroduced in schools and where school cooks have sourced and cooked from scratch local food from suppliers that live in the communities that they serve. These teachers speak of the difference in attention from classes in the afternoon, that children can listen, learn, and even that reading ages have increased as a result of that one simple single intervention. There is evidence, moreover, that providing prisoners and young offenders with nutritional supplements can significantly reduce their rates of reoffending. The government is due to give its response to the National Food Strategy shortly. The strategy itself did not receive unalloyed support. Some felt that the recommendations on farming and diet did not reflect the high standard of animal welfare and relatively low carbon impacts of grass-fed UK-bred livestock. However, it was a start. But the best movement starts from the bottom up and the top down. Whether farmer or consumer, we lack agency because we hand that agency over to somebody else. Whether it's the government in case of farm payments or supermarkets and food processors in the case of both communities. Yes, it's a complex landscape, and yes, the next few years are going to be more rather than less difficult. But, and perhaps this is very appropriate in a world-class centre of learning, for both groups, skills and training have to be the way forward, whether it's supporting farmers to plan their businesses for a sustainable climate change world or teaching kids how to be savvy with their shopping. The future is in our hands. We really just need to grasp it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. That was a wonderful expose and synthesis, I think, of the tensions between farming, nature, society, and the powerful. And I love the way you highlighted the lack of education, communication, collaboration, and understanding between farmers who produce the food, between the decision makers or powerful policy people at a private sector or a government sector, or those of us who actually eat the food, society. So thank you for a really delightful journey through the problems, the challenges. You were incisive, you were hard-hitting, but you also presented some really, for me at least, exciting options, opportunities and solutions to what is one of the biggest global challenges in how on earth we feed the world more sustainably, more fairly, and for the future. So thank you very much once again. For another fascinating talk, this time on food safety. Look forward to seeing you all in a week's time. Thank you.